Hello, good evening. Welcome back to another Trek Talk live stream here on Classic Comics. Looking at another episode of the original Star Trek series. This week, I'm going to be taking a look at the episode Dagger of the Mind. So, in production code order, this would be episode 10. This was written by Shimon Winselberg, although he did it under the pen name S. Bar David, and directed by Vincent McAveety. So I'm going to read, and as usual, I'm going to be reading from Mark Cushman's book, These Are the Voyages, for behind the scenes information on this episode. So this is from an NBC press release that was issued on October 17th, 1966. An escapee from a penal colony on another planet triggers an investigation of alleged maltreatment of prisoners in Dagger of the Mind on NBC Television Network's color cast of Star Trek. The near incoherent ramblings of Simon Van Gelder, played by Morgan Woodward, who secreted himself aboard the Enterprise in a cargo delivery from the prison, cannot be ignored by Captain James Kirk, despite his respect for the noted director of the colony, Dr. Tristan Adams. Accompanied by a medical aide, Dr. Helen Noel, Kirk goes inside the prison to learn the truth. Once there, Kirk reluctantly begins to suspect that Adams, a renowned expert on the human mind, may have a new agenda of mind control, which could push his staunch supporters, Kirk included, into madness. This episode melds two recurring Star Trek themes: the threat posed by unintended consequences of technology and the corruption of power. So, Dagger of the Mind gives us a first look in this episode at the Vulcan mind meld, which, like the neck pinch, went on to become a fixture of the series. While this may not make many fans' top 10 lists of favorite Star Trek episodes, it is nonetheless well crafted, entertaining, and delivers a thought provoking statement at its conclusion regarding intolerable solitude. I don't know. I don't know about the well crafted part. I'll get to that in time. But Adams is found dead, a classic depiction of the mad scientist who falls into his own torture machine. Dr. Helen Noel says, the machine wasn't on high enough to kill. Having been subjected to Adams's neural neutralizer, Kirk has the answer. He tells her, quote, but he was alone. Can you imagine the mind emptied out by that thing, and without even a tormentor for company? So this is the second episode in a row here, following on What Little Girls Are Made Of. It has a kind of similar plot structure to it, where the Enterprise comes to a planet, and on this planet there is this person who is like a renowned expert in a particular field, a researcher or scientist in a particular field, who Kirk greatly admires, and who eventually it is discovered is up to no good. And that's a plot structure that Star Trek will return to over time. I know which one is it? Whom Gods Destroy? Whom the Gods Destroy? I think that one has a similar plot element. There may be another one I'm forgetting. But let's go ahead and get into this one. So we begin with the Enterprise in orbit of Tantalus 5. They beam down some supplies to the penal colony on the planet, including infrasensory drugs, whatever those are. Now, after beaming them down, the Enterprise then beams up what they think is a shipment of records, which is bound to the Department of Penology on Earth, in Stockholm, no less. Those Scandinavians. You never know what they'll be up to. But instead of records, the crate contains crazy-eyed Eddie here, who knocks out the transporter chief and then gets loose on the ship. Now, as they depart the planet, Kirk expresses regret that he didn't get to meet Dr. Adams, a famed psychologist who runs the facility. Then the Enterprise receives a message from Tantalus 5 that one of their inmates, a potentially violent and dangerous case, has gone missing. Kirk orders a security alert, and very quickly the escaped inmate is spotted. A security team comes looking for him, but they are totally incompetent, and he quickly overpowers a guard and takes his phaser. Spock notes that humans glorify collective violence, but they punish those who employ violence individually. And McCoy sarcastically asks, "And you people found a solution?" To which Spock responds, "We have dispensed with emotion, Doctor. Where there is no emotion, there is no motive for violence." To which McCoy's like, "Yeah, well, okay, you got me there." Then Crazy Eye Eddie arrives on the bridge and he takes out another guard. And man, these guys are total, they're as bad as stormtroopers. And the inmate says that his name is Van Gelder and he asks for asylum on the Enterprise. And Kirk asks him to hand over his weapon, but he insists that Kirk first promise not to send him back to the planet or back to the prison on Tantalus 5. Now, Kirk refuses to make any promises, and he and Spock are able to subdue him. And we get another, I think this is the second incident of the nerve pinch here, I think. Let's see. Okay, I lost my place. Okay, yeah, and they send him to sick bay as they return to the penal colony. Now, the inmate says that his name is in the sick bay. Kirk asks the inmate who he is, but he seems to be overcome by pain whenever he tries to reveal any personal information. He becomes incensed, and insists he won't let them take him back to the penal colony, and Bones has to sedate him. Now, on the bridge, Spock tells Kirk that Van Gelder is a doctor, and he was assigned to the Tantalus penal colony 6 months ago. Kirk contacts Dr. Adams and asks him to explain Van Gelder's condition. Dr. Adams tells Kirk that Van Gelder invented an experimental beam to heal sick minds, but he decided to test it on himself and it has driven him mad, more or less. However, Bones questions this, but Kirk notes that Adams has done more to improve the treatment of the criminally mad than anyone else in history. Bones notes that as chief medical officer, he needs to question any medically related activity that is unusual, and Kirk, as captain, needs to answer those concerns. So Kirk tells Dr. Adams that he's going to need to come down and take a look at what Adams is doing, and Adams says that Kirk is welcome, but asks that a minimum number of people come down since it's a secure facility. Kirk asks Bones to recommend a member of the medical staff to come down to the colony, and Bones sends Dr. Noel, a psychiatrist with experience in penology. I'll let you make of that what you will. I mean, why doesn't Bones just go himself? You know, I mean, it's not like he doesn't beam down to planets all the time. And he's the one who's pushing for this investigation anyway. So in the transporter room, they arrive in the transporter room and they meet Dr. Helen Hottie here. And it turns out that they have some history. Apparently, they met at a Christmas party and Kirk smashed it, I assume. So on the planet, they meet Dr. Adams. Oh, yeah, and I forgot, we get a little bit of a booty shot here. You can see her underwear briefly under the skirt. Okay, so they meet Dr. Adams, who presents himself as a genial host. Kirk offers to surrender his weapon, but Adams assures him that that won't be necessary. They meet a former inmate named Letty, who now works as one of the facility's therapists, who says that she's a changed person now thanks to the treatment she has received at the penal colony. Dr. Adams proposes a toast. And I love how they just have this toast between the three of them and they just completely ignore the woman standing back there. It's like, why don't you join us? No, you just stand there. I mean, it's kind of rude. Now, on the Enterprise, Van Gelder mentions a device called a neural neutralizer. Spock asks for more information, but Van Gelder becomes agitated and he has to be sedated again. Now, Dr. Adams shows Kirk the neural neutralizer, but tells Kirk that it has largely been a failure. He also tells Kirk that Van Gelder's mind was damaged when he used the neutralizer on himself. Um, and when they next speak with Spock, he and Bones mention the neutralizer, but Dr. Noel dismisses any concerns that they might have. Kirk decides that they're going to stay for the night for some reason. But Van Gelder's like, no, no, don't let them stay, and warns them that Adams is dangerous, but he is unable to tell them how. And then we get our first example of the Vulcan mind meld. Okay, hold on, let me switch here. Here we go. And Spock proposes to do a mind meld on Van Gelder. But he mentions, and McCoy's like, okay, well, fine, go ahead and do it. But Spock's like, look, I can maybe do it, but I've never done this with a human before, so I don't know if it'll work. It might be dangerous. Which, in retrospect, is kind of funny when you think that as the series goes on over the course of the show, he's going to mind meld with, a Horta, with Nomad, which is a freaking machine, and I don't know, God knows, I don't even remember what else. Oh, with he tries mind melding with V'ger, in the motion picture. Oh, and a whale. He mind melds with a whale in Star Trek 4. Okay. So he goes ahead and he performs the mind meld. And during the mind meld, he probes Van Gelder's memories. Now, Kirk tells Noel that he wants to take another look at the neutralizer. And let's see, where am I? I keep losing my place here. Okay, here we go. He says that he wants to take another look at the neutralizer. Now, Noel dismisses his concerns, but Kirk insists. Now, on the Enterprise, Spock learns through the mind meld that Van Gelder's mind was damaged by Dr. Adams, who used the neural neutralizer on him. Meanwhile, Kirk, in one of the most foolish decisions I've ever seen him make, decides that he's going to let Dr. Noel test the neutralizer beam on himself, on him. And they discover that the beam can be used to implant suggestions in the mind of the subject. I mean, how is this in any way a good decision? you know this thing, it can alter people's minds. I'm going to get and we know that this may have actually driven someone mad, so you know what, I'm just going to get in this thing and you try it out on me and we'll see how it works. So she changes Kirk's memories of their encounter at the Christmas party. Instead of dancing together, she gives him memories in which they had a passionate love affair. And Kirk is like, yeah, I had snoo snoo. Then Adams interrupts and he takes control of the neutralizer. He then increases the beam and he brainwashes Kirk. and tells Kirk to surrender his phaser and his communicator. Now, when Kirk wakes up back in his room, he sends Dr. Noel into the ventilation duct to find the power supply and shut it down, which will deactivate the security field around the facility, allowing, personnel from the ship to beam down. Guards then arrive to take Kirk back to the neutralizer for another session. And this is another thing. So they open up the ventilation shaft, and Kirk's like, do you know anything about high powered circuits? And Dr. Noel's like, no. And then Kirk's like, okay, go to the power room and turn the power off. It's like he just told you she doesn't know. She just told you she doesn't know anything about this stuff. So why don't you go? But instead he's like, oh, you don't know anything? Okay, in you go take care of it. And with the whole thing with him getting into the machine, like she implants like a minor little suggestion in his mind, and then after suggesting it, then he's like, huh, okay, well, that was interesting. Why don't you crank up the juice on me and do something more? It's like, dude, what are you doing? This thing can fry your brain. Why are you letting her experiment? It's just it's ridiculous. Okay, so Kirk sends Dr. Noel into the ventilation duct to find the power supply and shut it off. And as soon as he shuts the screen to the duct and she's gone, immediately guards arrive to take him back to the neutralizer room for another session. Dr. Adams begins brainwashing Kirk again. And then he learns that Dr. Noel is missing. Dr. Adams does, that is, and he demands that Kirk tell him where Dr. Noel is. Now, eventually he cranks up the power to a point that it causes Kirk to fall unconscious. Dr. Noel finds the power supply, and I love this high-tech latch, this futuristic latch on the door here. It's just like an old metal slat latch, like from the frickin' 1800s. But she finds the power and she shuts it off, and this allows Kirk to overpower Adams and his assistant. And then Spock beams down and switches off the security field. But this doesn't quite make sense to me, because if the security field was still up, then how did he beam down in the first place? Because it was supposed to be blocking him. So that seems like a bit of a plot hole to me. So then after doing that, he switches the power field off. He then switches the power back on. And that reactivates the neutralizer, and Adams gets caught in the beam, and it begins, frying his brain. Kirk goes back to his room just in time for Dr. Noel to arrive back through the ventilation shaft. Then they make out a little. And then Spock arrives. And how did he find their room so fast? He just got there. But anyway, he arrives just in time to see them, making out. And he's like, really, bro? We were worried about you. And then they go right back to the neutralizer room. And I love McCoy's look here in this shot. He's just like, yeah, rough him up, kick his ass. And they come back to the neutralizer room and they find Adams dead. Dr. Noel says that the beam wasn't on that high. But then Kirk says that he must have died of loneliness, basically. Back on the Enterprise, Uhura tells Kirk that Van Gelder is having the neutralizer dismantled. Then McCoy says that it's hard to believe a man could die of loneliness, and Kirk says, not when you've been in that room. And it ends there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the background stuff in here. And of course, like I said, directed by Vincent McAvity, written by Espar David, alias Shimon, what is it, Winselberg, with James Gregory. Morgan Woodward, of course, DeForest Kelly is still a guest star at this point, and Mariana Hill as Helen Noel. Okay. Oops, hit the wrong thing. Okay, so Dagger of the Mind gives us, uh, let me see what here. Okay, so Simon Shyman Winselberg was 42, and he was a veteran of dozens of television series. He also wrote for the stage. One of his plays, Kataki, received rave reviews upon its opening in 1959. The New York Daily News called it a powerful suspense play scented strongly with the sweet smell of success. Time magazine said that it ticks with time bomb suspense. And the Hollywood Reporter wrote, quote, hats off to playwright Shyman Winselberg. Winselberg was one of producer Irwin Allen's favorite TV writers. He wrote Jonah and the Whale, the second season premiere episode of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and would also be considered practically a co-creator of Lost in Space if Irwin Allen had been willing to share the credits. Winselberg wrote the pilot, which later had additional subplots added in and was expanded into 5 hour-long episodes, launching and crash landing the Jupiter 2. He also wrote 2 additional early informative episodes. Roddenberry knew him from Have Gun Will Travel, where Winselberg wrote nearly as many episodes as Roddenberry did. Winselberg dropped by for the 3rd screening of Where No Man Has Gone Before at Desilu on March 9th of that year and was impressed. He was immediately invited to a pitch meeting. He remembered, quote, while I was waiting to meet Gene, his secretary, Dorothy Fontana, mentioned that some agents had the nerve to suggest writers who had written for Lost in Space. Yikes. Roddenberry, desperate for writers who understood the needs of TV as well as science fiction, took Winselberg's pitch despite the Lost in Space connection. He liked the irony of a healer of mental illness becoming the transmitter of mental illness in his own right through mind control and psychological torture, and put Winselberg on assignment. In fact, Dagger of the Mind was the first story assigned after Star Trek had emerged out of pilot mode. Winselberg amused himself in coming up with names for his characters. In his original story outline, the head of the penal colony was named Dr. Asgard. In Norse religion, Asgard translates to enclosure of the gods and was a place surrounded by walls where the gods lived. Dr. Asgard thinks of himself as godlike and he lives in a prison. One of the reformed inmates on Tantalus is named Lethe. She has clearly had her mind conditioned and selected memories suppressed by the doctor's brain probe. In Greek mythology, Lethe is the river of forgetfulness, one of the 7 rivers that runs through Hades. I thought that was the river Styx, but I could be wrong. Even the name of the penal colony has meaning. Again, the origin can be found in Greek mythology. Tantalus was the son of Zeus, who, after being condemned for his crimes, was made to rule in the deepest part of the underworld, a place reserved for evildoers. Dr. Asgard, feeling unappreciated, believes he too has been condemned, and he rules in an underworld of his own making, a madhouse deep below the surface of Tantalus 5. And actually, if you think about it, the term Tantalus does come up again in a later episode. In Mirror Mirror, I believe that device that the Mirror Kirk has in his quarters that he uses to eliminate people is called the Tantalus Field, I believe. Now, the character named Simon Van Gelder had significance as well. Simon Winselberg's daughter, author Berna Kranzler, said, quote, later on in his career, my father was somewhat less diplomatic, having a pseudonym for his work as well as naming villains in scripts after people who had pissed him off. Although Dr. Van Gelder was named after a family friend who told me at my father's funeral how honored he had been to have the character named after him. My father also had a murder committed in another show on a street called Berna Avenue so that the studio could then have to produce a street sign, and then I got to keep it. But his naming of villains didn't endear him to a lot of people in Hollywood. Winselberg also put great thought into the title he chose. Dagger of the Mind is from Macbeth. In Shakespeare's play, Macbeth is preparing to murder his king's children and thinks he sees a dagger in his hand, then realizes it is only a figment of his imagination. His soliloquy in part reads, quote, "Is this a dagger which I see before me? I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat oppressed brain?" The neural neutralizer is used to repress thoughts in the brains of its subjects, creating daggers in their minds and inflicting pain. The characters of Shakespeare are filled with self torture, and so are those subjects of Dr. Asgard. This includes Kirk and his companion on the trip to the colony, who, in the early treatments of the story, was Janice Rand, not Dr. Noel. Now, Winselberg's initial approach to the story had been far more in the realm of science fiction. It had more of a sci fi flavor, and there were more gimmicks and sci fi devices than in later versions. For instance, in the original treatment, hypnosis is not used to access Van Gelder's inhibited mind, as in later drafts. Instead, in the original story, Dr. McCoy uses a truth beam, whatever that is. Another device allows Asgard to look in on nightmarish things that the inmates see in their deranged minds through a series of moving pictures. Now, Roddenberry did a rewrite of the teleplay on July 22nd. And it was at this point that Janice Rand was removed from the story and replaced by Dr. Helen Noel, a member of McCoy's medical staff. Keeping with Winselberg's playfulness and having hidden meaning behind the characters' names, Roddenberry chose Noel since we are told Kirk first met her at a Christmas party in the science lab, Noel being French for Christmas. And this was also at the point that Dr. Asgard's name was changed to Dr. Adams. Now, as for the removal of Yeoman Rand, the official reason was that the producers wanted to avoid showing Kirk becoming romantically and physically involved with her, thereby allowing the understated sexual tension between the characters to continue. There were rumors on the set that suggested other reasons. Shatner's version goes like this, quote, Grace had become Grace had become noticeably distracted, visibly ill, and as a result her performance suffered. By the time we were filming our 10th episode, Grace's condition had worsened to the point where her scenes were consciously being given to other characters or completely written out of episodes. Unquote. Whitney counters this, insisting, quote, Bob Justman, who was present when the decision was made to put Dr. Helen Noel in the place of Janice Rand, told me that it was a creative decision based on the needs of the storyline and the characters. It was not a reflection on me, unquote. Justman, somewhat guarded on the subject when he was interviewed for this book, seemed to confirm Whitney's statement over that of Shatner's. He said, quote, I believe the removal of the character from any of the stories had to do with either the needs of the story, which would have come from Gene or John Black, or for monetary concerns, which would have come from me. In this instance, it was not a monetary issue, but Justman nonetheless had indirectly been the catalyst in getting Rand taken out and Noel replacing her. While reading out of one of the many drafts in this heavily rewritten script, he sent a memo to Roddenberry reading, quote, On page 39, I come to one of my more vehement objections to what I find in the screenplay. My reaction to page 39 and thereafter is that Kirk is an essentially stupid man for attempting to fool around with a machine that he knows nothing about. Yeah, I agree totally. You say this device fried a man's brain and drove him insane, huh? I tell you what, I'll climb in it and you test it on me and we'll see what happens. What? Dude. It did seem foolish for Kirk to sit in the neural neutralizer chair and instruct a mere yeoman to work the controls. However, with a trained medical professional at the switches, such as Dr. Noel, Kirk's stupidity wasn't quite so blatant. It certainly made better sense that Kirk would request a specialist in psychology to accompany him to the penal colony. Yeah, I agree with that. A captain's yeoman could hardly have provided him with the support or given the story the conflict that the strong willed female doctor could. As for the suggestion Dr. Noel puts into Kirk's mind, something left over from the last draft to feature Janice Rand, who secretly loves Kirk, Justman wrote, "We might have a slight censorship problem with NBC with regard to the fantasies Kirk imagines." Grace Lee Whitney was not the only cast member who was written into the script and then written out. James Doohan as Scotty was also originally going to be in the episode, but he was written out, and this was apparently more of a monetary issue. Uh, Robert Justman just felt that his part was so small that his part could be given to other characters, and they wouldn't have to pay him as much or pay the other actors as much. Okay, so an important change to the script came about because of a memo from NBC's uh, broadcast and standards department, one which would showcase Spock's telepathic abilities. In Winselberg's earlier drafts, as well as John Black's script polish, there was little that was special about the interchange between McCoy, Spock, and Van Gelder in sickbay. Leonard Nimoy remembered his first look at the script, finding it to be a dull expository scene in which Van Gelder gets interrogated at length. At one point, Van Gelder is hypnotized in order for McCoy and Spock to gain access to the secrets of his mind, and it is Spock who does the hypnotizing. The broadcast and standards department was adamant about the following quote, in accordance with the precautions to avoid accidentally hypnotizing a viewer, the act of hypnotizing must either be out of context or done off camera. Further, since you are portraying hypnotism as a legitimate medical tool, Van Gelder should be hypnotized by Dr. McCoy rather than Mr. Spock, unless Mr. Spock can be established as being qualified in the use of this technique. In order to have Spock provided the needed qualifications to hypnotize somebody, Roddenberry came up with the idea of the mind meld, something that would give broadcast standards no reason to fret about unintended effects on home viewers. Once again, an occasion when the difficult alliance between Star Trek and NBC brought about a positive change. Shyman Winselberg had reason to think that Roddenberry was enamored with his talent. After turning in his fourth draft script for Dagger of the Mind, he was given a second assignment and delivered two drafts of a storyline, The Squaw, which I'm guessing probably eventually became, oh, oh crap, I'm blanking on the episode, the one where Kirk becomes a Native American, unquote. What was the name of that one? Oh, okay, I can't remember. While awaiting verdict on The Squaw, Winselberg was put to work rewriting the Galileo 7, a problematic teleplay started by another writer. Then he saw Roddenberry's rewrite of Dagger. Uh, he then fired off a memo to Roddenberry saying, quote, even though you have in many places improved the script, you have also been carried away by a healthy creative momentum and quote unquote improved a lot of scenes which conceivably could have been left alone, if only to satisfy this poor writer's vanity. The overall effect on me, at least, is something of a morale depressant. I shall resume my labors on Galileo with hopefully undiminished enthusiasm as soon as I get my friendly neighborhood quack to use a neural neutralizer on me in order to remove the image of Dagger from my bleeding mind. Roddenberry scribbled across Winselberg's letter 2 words: fuck him. And the sentiment was soon returned. A letter arrived from Ed Pearlstein, Desilu's legal aide, and Winselberg did not want to take credit or blame for the writing of Dagger of the Mind. He instead decided to use a pseudonym, Espar David. The decision to use a pseudonym for his screen credit was a slap in the face to Roddenberry, especially since Winselberg had allowed his real name to go on the screen more than once for Lost in Space. Roddenberry later said, Star Trek gave a writer an opportunity to do something more than what other shows did at the time. Some were up to the challenge, others weren't. Some were threatened by it and would go back to Lost in Space, unquote. Shots fired, I believe. So Vincent McAveety, having pleased everyone with his handling of Balance of Terror, returned to direct this episode as well, and he was allowed to make suggestions for the casting. Now, James Gregory, let me bring him up here. Where is he? There he is. So James Gregory was hired to play Dr. Adams. He was 54 at the time. He was a familiar face on television and film of this era. Gregory had been acting before the camera since 1948. He was a regular on a 1959 series, The Lawless Years, and appeared often on Bonanza, Gunsmoke, and scores of other shows. He met Roddenberry on The Lieutenant, appearing in 2 episodes. Still in Gregory's future would be his best known role as the irascible Inspector Luger in 49 episodes of Barney Miller. Morgan Woodward, where is he? There he is. Morgan Woodward, playing Dr. Simon Van Gelder, was 40. He was 40. Man, he looks older. He looks like he's 60. They loved him on TV westerns where he played a variety of dastardly characters, including 8 episodes of Bonanza, 12 of Wagon Train, and 20 episodes of Gunsmoke, often working with his friend, director Vincent McAveety. Woodward was a regular on one of the many westerns he appeared in, with a supporting role as Deputy Shotgun Gibbs in The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp from 1958 to 1961. McAveety said, quote, Morgan Woodward could play anything. The more demanding the role, the quicker I was to suggest him. He could play out of his head and you still wanted to like him. You got to care. That's a good actor, unquote. Regarding the role, Woodward said, when I heard a favorite director of mine wanted me, and when I read the script, I really wanted to do that part. I recognized it as a difficult part. Unfortunately, my friend, the director, felt I could do it, and I certainly wanted to show him I could do it, unquote. Mariana Hill, and that's her here. And I love this shot here. I love how Kirk is just giving her the stink eye. Mariana Hill was cast as Helen Noel. She was 25 at the time. Hill had been on television since 1960, working prolifically, including a recurring role in Samuel Peoples' series The Tall Man, and with Leonard Nimoy in the I, Robot episode of The Outer Limits. Justman knew her from an appearance on Dr. Kildare. Okay. Okay. Where is the next part here? Okay, here we go. Now, so when they beam down to the planet, this is another change they made for budgetary reasons. So when Kirk and Dr. Noel beam down, they initially beam down to the surface. and then they just immediately then get into an elevator and go deep underground. So Bob Justman, again wanting to save money, said, why don't they just beam down into the facility? Because we have the scene where we're going to have them on the surface. That means we're going to need to have a physical set, but then we're also going to have to create a matte painting, for the background, and then it's only going to be on the screen for like 10 seconds, and then they're going to be in the elevator and then down in the facility. So why don't we just skip this? But Roddenberry liked the idea of beaming down onto the barren planet because the surface of the planet being barren would help justify why the facility was so deep underground, because the surface was so unpleasant. And what they wound up doing is they wound up recycling the matte painting of the lithium station, the lithium mining station on Delta Vega, from Where No Man Has Gone Before. A couple of minor changes were made to it in order to distinguish it. An upper level grid and towering tanks were airbrushed out, making the complex look a little less industrial. By leveraging leftover sets from the previous episode and minimizing the need for special effects, the tab for Dagger of the Mind was $182,140, several $1,000s short of the studio mandated per episode budget of $193,500. Now, this episode aired on November 3rd, 1966, and it won its time slot with a 24.3 ratings share in the first half hour, beating out The Dating Game and My Three Sons, which were almost tied. Let's see here. So, a second report from Nielsen, after a more detailed study of rural areas across America, shifted the numbers in favor of the tastes of people living in smaller towns, putting Star Trek in a tie with My Three Sons at number 2 for the 8:30 to 9 spot. Yeah, so in the 8:30 to 9 spot, The Dating Game won with a 20.2 audience share, and then Star Trek and My Three Sons both had a 17.5. The shift in rankings makes it clear that those who lived in cities in the mid 1960s had a different perspective on the popularity of Star Trek than those in smaller communities. Star Trek was often the ratings leader in major metropolitan areas. Among those watching Star Trek in the cities was Morgan Woodward. He said, quote, when it first aired, I was watching and thought maybe I'd overdone it a bit. I'd done so many westerns and played so many villains, but never quite anything like this. Then my agent called and said, quote, I didn't know you could act like that. And Woodward said, well, I've been working with you for a few years. Maybe you should pay more attention. Vincent approved of everything I did, and Gene Roddenberry liked it so much that he nominated me for an Emmy with that performance, so I suppose my instincts were right in the first place. Grace Lee Whitney, who had read the early draft of the script, which still included her, and had been looking forward to filming this episode, remembered seeing the only network airing of Dagger of the Mind. She said, the hardest thing was to watch someone else saying my lines. Because of where it fell in the schedule, Dagger was not given a repeat viewing over the summer. So this was, when it initially aired, was the only time it was ever shown on network television. Now, despite the gut-wrenching performance he got from his friend Morgan Woodward, director McAvity said, I don't remember liking that show a hell of a lot. And in 2013, Woodward said, my mind was made a vacuum by that neural neutralizer, and I've never recovered. Now, in 1998, South Park did an episode that parodies Dagger of the Mind. The episode is called Robert Ebert Should Lay Off the Fatty Foods. On a field trip to the local planetarium, the South Park kids are certain they will hate the experience until they watch the Star Show. Suddenly, they become planetarium enthusiasts, returning often and even volunteering to work there. The reason the director of the planetarium, named Dr. Adams, is brainwashing them with the star projector. School counselor Mr. Mackey uses an ancient school counselor technique called a mind meld on a kid named Van Gelder who had escaped from Dr. Adams. In a climactic showdown at the planetarium, the star projector is knocked over, resulting in Dr. Adams receiving a full blast of the mind controlling machine. With no one around to talk him through it, the evil doctor becomes a mindless shell. I don't remember that one. Okay, so what to grade this one? So I've gone back and forth on this. I think mainly, I go back and forth between a grade of B minus or a C plus. I guess I'll go with B minus. I just have several issues with this episode. Again, there's the whole ridiculous choice by Kirk to use the neutralizer on himself. And Noelle, who is allegedly like a professional, using the neutralizer to create a fake romance with Kirk. And the episode is just clunky, I think. People making a lot of nonsensical choices. Also, just a lot of plot convenience. Kirk sends Helen into the ventilator shaft, and he turns around, and then immediately the guards are there, and they take him to the neutralizer room after he gets free of the neutralizer. Kirk returns to the room just as Helen returns from the power room, just long enough for them to make out for a second. Then Spock shows up. How did he find their room so quickly? He just got to this facility. And then Kirk immediately turns and goes back to the neutralizer room to find Adams dead. It just feels like there's a lot of railroading in the script. Spock beams in just as Helen leaves the power room and then turns the security field back on. How did he beam in the first place if the security field was still on? And then he turns the power back on. So, yeah, of the episodes I've watched so far, this is the first one that to me is really kind of disappointing, and that I would say that the writing is not that good, not that great. It's not terrible, but it is, compared to what's come before and the bar that's been set by the show so early on, it's a bit substandard, in my opinion. So yeah, I'll give it I guess I'll go with a B minus and be nice. Okay, so next week I'll be looking at episode 11 in production order, which is Miri. Before I go, please do like the stream, and please do sub to the channel, and also please maybe check out some of my other videos while you're here. Thanks to those who tune in during the stream and those who will catch it on a rewatch. And yes, I'll be back next week with Miri. So until then, everyone, have a good evening.